we think about maritime disasters, a few names immediately come to mind. The Titanic, struck by an iceberg in 1912. The Lusitania, torpedoed during the First World War. Perhaps the Andrea Doria, colliding in the 1950s. These tragedies are etched into the cultural memory of the world, taught in schools, dramatized in films, and mourned in countless books and documentaries. But there is another name, one that dwarfs all of these in terms of human loss. A name that should stand as a symbol of unimaginable suffering at sea, yet is scarcely mentioned outside of specialized history books. The Wilhelm Gustloff. On the night of January 30th, 1945, in the frozen waters of the Baltic Sea, this German passenger liner, packed beyond imagination with refugees, soldiers, and children, was struck by 3 torpedoes fired from a Soviet submarine. In less than an hour, she was gone. The sea swallowed thousands of lives in a single night. Estimates suggest that more than 9,000 people died. Men, women, the elderly, and most heartbreakingly, children. To put that in perspective, the Titanic's death toll, one of the most infamous tragedies of the modern age, was around 2,500. The Lusitania lost about 1,200. Even the deadliest wartime sinkings pale in comparison to what happened aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff. It remains to this day the largest loss of life in a single maritime disaster. And yet, most of the world doesn't know this story. Why? Part of the answer lies in the timing. This was not a peacetime disaster, but a tragedy that unfolded during the final months of the Second World War. By then, millions were already dying across Europe. In the Holocaust, on the Eastern Front, under Allied bombing raids. In the vast scale of global suffering, the destruction of a single ship, even one carrying 10,000 souls, faded into the background. Another reason is the identity of the victims. The passengers on the Wilhelm Gustloff were primarily German civilians and military personnel fleeing the Soviet advance. In the post-war years, German suffering was rarely emphasized. The world's focus, understandably, was on the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime, not on the tragedies endured by its own people. The Wilhelm Gustloff became a kind of historical footnote, overshadowed by the enormity of the war itself. But to forget this event is to erase the humanity of those aboard. Behind the numbers were mothers clutching newborn babies, elderly grandparents too frail to walk without help, wounded soldiers with bandaged limbs, teenage naval cadets, and families who had already lost everything. These were people desperate to survive, boarding a ship they believed would take them to safety, only to find themselves trapped in one of the greatest horrors of the sea. In this documentary, we will journey through the full story of the Wilhelm Gustloff. We'll explore how this ship began as a symbol of Nazi leisure, part of Hitler's propaganda machine, before becoming a hospital ship and then a floating barracks. We'll step into the chaotic world of January 1945, when millions fled westward in terror of the Red Army. We'll board the Gustloff on its final voyage, where more than 10,000 people crammed into every cabin, hallway, and deck. We'll relive the fateful night when Soviet submarine S-13 struck, sending the ship to the bottom of the Baltic. And we'll listen to the haunting testimonies of those few who survived, who carried the weight of memory for decades while the world largely ignored their tragedy. This is not just the story of a ship. It is the story of human desperation, the cost of war, and the fragility of life in times of chaos. It is a story of voices silenced too soon, of children whose names were never written down, of families that vanished without a trace. It is also a story of survival, of the resilience of the human spirit, and of the moral complexities of remembering suffering on all sides of war. Over the next 50 minutes, we will uncover why the Wilhelm Gustloff matters. We will explore not just the events of that terrible night, but also the broader historical forces that led to it, and the reasons the world has chosen to forget. So, let us begin. Let us travel back to a frozen winter in 1945, to a crumbling Third Reich, and to a ship that promised salvation but delivered only death. This is the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff, the forgotten Titanic of World War II. Archival images of 1930s Germany, workers at shipyards, Nazi rallies, and leisure cruises. To understand the fate of the Wilhelm Gustloff, we must first understand its beginnings. This ship was not designed for war. It was not built with military might in mind. Instead, it was created as part of a grand political experiment, one that sought to blend propaganda with leisure and ideology with tourism. The ship was commissioned in the mid-1930s during Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Germany. At the time, the Nazi regime was eager not only to consolidate its control, but also to present itself as a benefactor to the German people. One of the ways it attempted this was through the organization known as Kraft durch Freude, or Strength Through Joy. Strength Through Joy was a state-operated leisure program. Its aim was to show that under Nazi rule, the common worker could enjoy privileges once reserved for the wealthy. This included subsidized holidays, theater trips, sporting events, and, most significantly, cruises. Cruising in the 1930s was largely an activity of the elite. Only the rich could afford to sail the Mediterranean or tour Northern Europe by ship. But Hitler's government wanted to change that perception. By building a cruise liner specifically for workers, the regime could promote itself as caring for the ordinary man while also spreading Nazi ideology abroad. And so, the Wilhelm Gustloff was born. The ship was laid down at the Blumenvoss shipyard in Hamburg in 1936. It was named after Wilhelm Gustloff, a Nazi functionary who headed the party's branch in Switzerland. Gustloff had been assassinated that same year by a young Jewish student named David Frankfurter. His death was quickly used by Nazi propaganda to portray him as a martyr of the movement. Naming a ship after him was a way of cementing his place in the party's mythology. When the Wilhelm Gustloff was launched in 1937, it was hailed as a marvel of German engineering and a symbol of the new Reich. At over 25,000 gross tons and nearly 700 feet long, she was not as massive as transatlantic liners like the Queen Mary or the Normandy, but she was large enough to carry around 1,800 passengers in comfort. What made the Wilhelm Gustloff unique was not just her size, but her design. Unlike luxury liners that separated passengers by class, the Gustloff had only one class. Every cabin was intended to be of equal standard, symbolizing the Nazi ideal of a unified people's community, at least in theory. Each passenger, whether a factory worker or a minor party official, would eat the same meals, sleep in similar rooms, and enjoy the same facilities. On board were a swimming pool, a theater, a ballroom, spacious dining areas, and promenade decks. For many Germans who sailed on her before the war, the experience was unforgettable. Ordinary workers who had never dreamed of a holiday cruise suddenly found themselves sunbathing on Mediterranean beaches or exploring Scandinavian ports. The propaganda value was immense. Abroad, the sight of cheerful German workers traveling on a beautiful liner projected an image of prosperity and unity. But the Wilhelm Gustloff was never just a cruise ship. From the moment she was launched, she was a floating advertisement for Nazi Germany. Her voyages were carefully staged, her passengers carefully selected, and her presence in foreign ports carefully choreographed. She was, in many ways, a tool of soft power, a way to show the world that under Hitler, Germany was modern, efficient, and generous to its people. Yet, this image was a facade. Behind the scenes, the Nazi regime was already preparing for war, rearming at a rapid pace and suppressing dissent at home. The very workers who enjoyed discounted cruises were also subjected to strict control, censorship, and indoctrination. The Wilhelm Gustloff, gleaming in the sun as she carried vacationers abroad, masked the growing darkness in Europe. With the outbreak of World War II in September 1939, the Gustloff's role as a leisure ship ended abruptly. The once proud cruise liner was quickly repurposed. Her white hull was painted gray, her ballrooms stripped, her lounges converted to infirmaries. She became a hospital ship, transporting wounded soldiers back from the front. Later, as the war dragged on, she was used as a floating barracks for naval trainees, particularly U-boat crews. The transformation of the Wilhelm Gustloff mirrored the transformation of Germany itself. What had begun as a nation presenting itself as modern, prosperous, and benevolent was now fully consumed by war. What had begun as a ship promising leisure and joy was now a tool of survival and military necessity. Still, even in her new role, traces of her origins remained. Survivors who boarded her in 1945 recalled the odd contrast between the elegant architecture of her corridors, remnants of her cruise ship days, and the grim atmosphere of overcrowding, military presence, and fear. The Gustloff Ad's identity as both a symbol of Nazi pride and an instrument of wartime desperation made her story all the more tragic. By the final winter of the war, the Wilhelm Gustloff was no longer a ship of joy. She was no longer a hospital ship, She was not even just a barracks. She became something else entirely. A lifeline for tens of thousands of desperate civilians trying to escape the oncoming storm. And as we will see, the very origins of the ship, her name, her propaganda routes, and her symbolic role would contribute to the silence that followed her destruction. The world was not ready to mourn a ship named after a Nazi, even if its passengers were mostly innocent civilians. The Wilhelm Gustloff story began as a promise of joy. It would end as the greatest maritime disaster the world has ever seen. To truly understand the tragedy of the Wilhelm Gustloff, we must first step into the world of January 1945. The Allies had landed in France months earlier, and Western armies were advancing toward the Rhine. In the east, the Red Army was pushing relentlessly through Poland and East Prussia, bringing the war to German soil. For millions of civilians, especially in the east, this meant something far more terrifying than just military defeat. It meant invasion, occupation, and in many cases, brutal retribution. The Eastern Front had been the bloodiest theater of the war. For years, German forces had ravaged Soviet towns, executed civilians, and left behind a trail of destruction. Now, as the tide turned, many Soviet soldiers sought revenge. German propaganda spread tales of atrocities. Villages burned, women assaulted, executions carried out in the streets. Some of these reports were exaggerated, but many were chillingly true. And whether rumor or reality, the effect was the same: fear. In January 1945, the Soviet Union launched its Vistula Oder offensive. Entire German towns emptied overnight as people grabbed what they could carry and fled westward. In the frozen winter, families loaded carts with whatever possessions they had left. Some walked hundreds of miles in snow and ice, children crying from hunger and exhaustion. Others were forced onto the roads by German officials, told to evacuate ahead of the Soviet advance. The once proud Reich was now a nation of refugees. Amid this chaos, the German Navy began Operation Hannibal. This was one of the largest sea evacuations in history, far larger even than the famous Dunkirk evacuation of 1940. From January to May 1945, an estimated 2 million people, soldiers, wounded men, women, and children, were transported across the Baltic Sea from East Prussia and Poland to safer territory in the west. The Baltic, however, was no safe haven. It was filled with naval mines, German ships running low on fuel, and Soviet submarines hunting prey. Each voyage was a gamble between salvation and death. It was in this desperate climate that the Wilhelm Gustloff was chosen to play its final role. Once a ship of leisure, later a floating barracks, she was now transformed into an evacuation vessel. But the scale of the refugee crisis was overwhelming. Train stations and ports overflowed with people begging for transport. Mothers pleaded with officers to take their children aboard. Soldiers, wounded and exhausted, demanded passage. The Luftwaffe had lost control of the skies, and Soviet aircraft regularly strafed columns of civilians on the roads. The Baltic seemed the only escape route left. For many, the Wilhelm Gustloff represented not just a ship, it represented hope, a promise of escape from the advancing Red Army, a promise of survival. Yet, that hope came at a terrible cost. The weather added to the misery. The Baltic in January was bitterly cold, with ice floes drifting through the waters. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Passengers waiting to board ships often stood for hours in snow and wind, carrying bundles of food, blankets, or whatever possessions they could save. Some died before ever setting foot on a vessel. The Wilhelm Gustloff, still stationed in the port of Gottenhafen, modern-day Gdynia, Poland, became a magnet for refugees. News spread quickly that she would soon depart westward. Crowds surged toward the harbor, desperate to secure a place aboard. But desperation meant overcrowding. Ships were filled to several times their intended capacity. Order and discipline broke down. Families were separated. Soldiers tried to push their way aboard. People bribed officials or simply climbed the gangways by force. By January 1945, Germany was not a nation of control and order. It was a nation of panic, chaos, and collapse. And the Wilhelm Gustloff would soon become the stage where all of these forces, war, fear, desperation, and fate, collided in the most tragic way possible. When she left port on that fateful evening, she was carrying more than just passengers. She carried the final, desperate hopes of a crumbling empire. She carried the dreams of survival for thousands who had lost everything. She carried mothers praying their children might live to see another day. But instead of deliverance, the voyage would end in catastrophe. The world was collapsing around these people, and the Wilhelm Gustloff was their last fragile lifeline in a sea of chaos. The Wilhelm Gustloff was never designed for what happened in January 1945. Built to carry just under 2,000 passengers and crew in comfort, she would be loaded with more than 10,000 desperate souls on her final voyage. At the port of Gottenhofen, scenes of unimaginable desperation unfolded. Word had spread quickly that the Gustloff was preparing to sail west, away from the advancing Soviet armies. Families from East Prussia and beyond flooded into the port, dragging what few possessions they had left. Mothers carried infants wrapped in blankets. The elderly leaned on canes or were pushed in makeshift carts. Soldiers on crutches hobbled forward, determined to escape. The docks were jammed with humanity. The air was filled with shouting, pleading, and crying. Soldiers tried to maintain order, but order was impossible. For every space aboard the ship, there were 10 people begging to be taken. Some were naval cadets, still barely teenagers, assigned to board as part of the evacuation. Others were wounded soldiers, stretcher-bound, their bandages stained and frozen in the cold air. But the overwhelming majority were civilians, ordinary Germans caught in the path of the Soviet advance. Every corridor, every stairwell, every lounge on the ship was soon overflowing. Cabins built for 2 or 3 held 10, sometimes more. The great dining halls, once filled with music and laughter during peacetime cruises, became makeshift dormitories, crowded with refugees sitting shoulder to shoulder. Even the swimming pool was drained and filled with cots and mattresses to accommodate the flood of passengers. The conditions quickly turned grim. Toilets overflowed. The kitchens were not equipped to feed so many mouths. Food was scarce. Some refugees had brought bread, potatoes, or jars of preserves, but many had nothing at all. Mothers clutched their children close, terrified of losing them in the crowd. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, illness, and fear. On the outer decks, the situation was no better. Refugees huddled against the icy wind, wrapping themselves in blankets, sheets, or even sacks in an attempt to stay warm. Some tried to build makeshift shelters out of whatever materials they could find: boards, tarpaulins, spare canvas, anything to shield themselves from the Baltic winter. And still, more kept coming. German officers were faced with an impossible decision. Who would be allowed aboard and who would be left behind? Survivors later recalled the chaos. Children lost in the crowd, crying out for their parents. Families separated as the ship's gangways became choke points of human desperation. At least one mother, realizing she could not secure a place for her entire family, reportedly pressed her infant into the arms of a stranger already aboard, begging them to save the child before being pushed back into the crowd. By the time the Wilhelm Gustloff was ready to depart, she was dangerously overloaded. Estimates vary, but most historians agree that at least 10,000 people were on board, possibly more. This included around 4,000 civilians, 1,000 wounded soldiers, and over 2,000 naval cadets in addition to crew and other personnel. The overcrowding created hidden dangers. Lifeboats were frozen to their davits, meaning they could not be lowered easily in an emergency. The ship's heating system was barely functioning, leaving passengers shivering in the cold. Safety drills were ignored. There was no way to organize such a massive crowd, many of whom had never set foot on a ship before. And beneath it all was the crushing weight of fear. The refugees knew the Soviet advance was only days, perhaps hours, away. They had heard the horror stories of villages burned, women assaulted, civilians executed. The Gustloff was their last chance to escape, and so they clung to it, even as it became a floating powder keg of human misery. Some passengers tried to hold on to a sense of normality. Mothers told their children that they were going on an adventure, that the ship would take them somewhere safe where the war could not reach. Teenagers laughed nervously in groups, trying to hide their fear. Naval cadets sang songs to lift spirits, their voices echoing through overcrowded corridors. But beneath the surface, everyone knew the truth. The Gustloff was not a safe haven. It was a gamble. A single torpedo, a mine, or even a storm could spell catastrophe. Yet for most, there was no choice. Staying behind meant certain death or worse. When the Wilhelm Gustloff finally prepared to leave port on the afternoon of January 30th, she was less a ship and more a symbol of desperation, a vessel carrying the last hopes of thousands who had already lost everything. The decks groaned under the weight of humanity. The cabins, once symbols of luxury, now stank of overcrowding and fear. The freezing Baltic wind whipped across the faces of children huddled in blankets. And as the mooring lines were cast off, the Wilhelm Gustloff began her final voyage, a floating city of refugees sailing toward destiny. What none of them knew was that their greatest fear, the silent hunters of the Baltic Soviet submarines, was already waiting. On the afternoon of January 30th, 1945, the Wilhelm Gustloff pulled away from the docks of Gotenhafen. What should have been a voyage of safety and relief was, in reality, a journey into one of the darkest nights in maritime history. The ship carried far more than she was ever designed to bear. Over 10,000 souls packed into her hull, her decks, her passageways, and even her drained swimming pool. The weight of humanity pressed on every beam and bulkhead. Yet to the refugees huddled aboard, departure itself brought a moment of hope. They were leaving the collapsing Eastern Front behind. The Baltic Sea stretched before them, a frozen expanse of water where danger lurked unseen. This was no safe crossing. The sea was patrolled by Soviet submarines, hunting German vessels in revenge for the destruction the Wehrmacht had inflicted upon their homeland. The Wilhelm Gustloff was escorted by a small convoy, just a few torpedo boats to guard against enemy attack. But even this protection was thin. The ship's size made her a visible target, a lumbering whale in a sea full of sharks. As she steamed westward, the air on board was thick with tension. Refugees whispered prayers, mothers rocked their children to sleep, and soldiers kept watch on deck. The icy wind bit through clothing, and frost gathered on the ship's railings. Beneath the surface, the Gustloff's engines groaned, forcing the overloaded vessel slowly forward. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The overcrowding had only grown worse since departure. Every stairwell was jammed, every bench taken, every patch of floor claimed by someone desperate to rest. The air smelled of sweat, coal smoke, and fear. Some passengers tried to pass the time by playing cards or singing quietly, but most simply sat in silence, staring at nothing, their minds gripped by exhaustion and dread. To make matters worse, a fateful decision was made. Instead of sailing close to the coastline, which might have offered more protection, the Wilhelm Gustloff set a course farther out to sea. There were fears of German mines laid along the coast, but this choice placed the ship in open waters, precisely where Soviet submarines waited. On the bridge, the ship's officers argued about the best course of action. Some urged staying close to the coast, despite the risk of mines. Others argued for open waters, fearing ambush from Soviet patrol boats. In the end, the decision to head outward would prove fatal. The evening deepened into night. Snow began to fall lightly, coating the decks in white. The Baltic lay dark and menacing beneath the ship's keel. The escorting torpedo boats were little comfort to the thousands of refugees aboard, who could not forget the rumors of submarines lurking just beyond the horizon. In the lounges, naval cadets tried to stay busy. Many were young men who had only recently been called into service. Some of them sang naval songs to distract themselves from the cold and fear. Wounded soldiers lay quietly in rows of cots, tended to by nurses who moved from bed to bed with little more than bandages and hot tea to offer. For a brief moment, as darkness fell, the Gustloff seemed almost calm. Passengers who had space near portholes looked out into the night, where the snowflakes danced on the icy wind. Parents tried to soothe restless children with promises of safety, of a new home far from the horrors of the war. But beneath the calm lay danger. Out in the black waters of the Baltic, the Soviet submarine S-13, commanded by Captain Alexander Marinesko, had spotted the Gustloff. The massive liner, lit up against the night sky with her navigation lights, was an irresistible target. The Wilhelm Gustloff was steaming toward destiny, unaware that her fate had already been sealed. The hours dragged on. The overloaded ship pressed forward, creaking under her human cargo. Each moment seemed suspended, as though the ship itself hesitated to move further into danger. And then, shortly after 9 p.m., the silence of the night sea was broken. In the darkness, hidden beneath the frozen waves, Captain Marinesko ordered the firing of torpedoes. 3 deadly shapes streaked through the black water, invisible to the passengers who sat above, dreaming of safety. They cut silently toward the Wilhelm Gustloff, carrying with them the doom of thousands. Aboard the ship, no one yet knew. Refugees clutched their blankets. Cadets dozed in their chairs. Wounded soldiers groaned in their makeshift infirmaries. Mothers whispered lullabies to restless children. And then suddenly, the torpedoes struck. At 9:16 p.m., the first torpedo struck. The Wilhelm Gustloff shuddered violently, as if the sea itself had risen to tear her apart. A thunderous roar echoed through the decks, and in an instant, panic spread like wildfire. Passengers were thrown from their bunks, children screamed, lights flickered, and the once crowded ship became a scene of unimaginable chaos. The first torpedo slammed into the bow of the ship, tearing open compartments where crew and passengers were packed tightly together. Within moments, icy seawater surged in, drowning dozens instantly. Then came the second. It hit the side of the ship where the women's quarters had been established. The impact tore through walls and steel as though they were paper. Entire sections of the ship were plunged into darkness. Hundreds of women and children were killed outright, never even realizing what had happened. The third torpedo struck near the engine room, crippling the ship's power. Lights failed, the engines stopped, and the Wilhelm Gustloff went dead in the water. The once grand liner, filled with thousands of desperate souls, now floated helplessly, mortally wounded in the frozen Baltic. For the people aboard, the nightmare was only beginning. Panic erupted immediately. Refugees stampeded toward the lifeboats. Mothers clutched their children and screamed for help. Soldiers tried to force their way through the crowds. In the darkness, cries of "Torpedo, torpedo" rang out. The carefully maintained order dissolved into pure terror. Inside the packed corridors, chaos reigned. With so many people crammed into the ship, movement was nearly impossible. Stairwells became choke points as hundreds tried to push upward at once. Those who stumbled were trampled. Families were torn apart in the rush. Children separated from parents, husbands from wives. The lifeboats, already too few for the thousands on board, were another disaster. Many were frozen to their davits, locked in place by ice. Others were so poorly prepared that ropes snapped as soon as weight was applied. In the frenzy, some lifeboats were lowered too quickly, smashing into the ship's side and killing those inside. On deck, the icy wind cut like knives. Passengers who had fought their way up found themselves exposed to the brutal cold. Frostbite set in within minutes. Snow swirled as the ship listed slowly to port, making the task of lowering lifeboats nearly impossible. The crew, overwhelmed and terrified themselves, struggled to maintain control. Some officers shouted orders that were drowned out by the screams of the panicked masses. Others abandoned ship altogether, leaping into lifeboats or the icy waters below. Below deck, the situation was even worse. The torpedo blast had sealed the fate of hundreds trapped in flooded compartments. Water rushed in with unstoppable force. People clawed at locked doors, pounded on bulkheads, screamed for help. But the sea silenced them quickly. For the naval cadets and wounded soldiers, survival was almost impossible. Many of them were too weak to move, lying helpless in their bunks as water poured in. Nurses tried desperately to save them, but most perished in the flood. Meanwhile, parents faced impossible choices. In the scramble, some mothers handed their infants to strangers, hoping at least the children might survive. Others clung desperately to their families, refusing to let go even as the water closed in. The Gustloff was sinking fast. Within minutes, the ship had taken on a sharp list, tilting heavily to one side. Passengers slipped on the icy decks, sliding helplessly into the freezing sea. And the Baltic was merciless. The water temperature was just above freezing, enough to kill within minutes. Those who jumped or were thrown overboard quickly succumbed to hypothermia. Cries for help echoed across the waves, then faded into silence as the cold claimed them. Back on board, the struggle continued. Some lifeboats managed to launch, but most carried only a fraction of their intended capacity due to the chaos. Others were overloaded and capsized immediately, spilling screaming passengers into the dark sea. The sounds of the disaster were haunting: metal tearing apart, children crying, mothers praying, men shouting orders no one could follow. And underneath it all, the relentless rush of water filling the ship. Captain Friedrich Petersen and his officers stayed on the bridge, trying to send out distress calls. But the ship's power had been crippled, and communication was limited. Some messages did reach nearby German vessels, but by the time help could arrive, it would be too late for most. The Wilhelm Gustloff's once proud silhouette now lay broken against the stormy horizon, her decks crowded with the doomed. Within less than 40 minutes of the torpedo's strike, the ship was already sinking. Thousands remained trapped inside. Thousands more clung to her icy rails, screaming into the night, And then at last the great liner began her final plunge. The Wilhelm Gustloff was mortally wounded. From the moment the Soviet torpedoes tore into her side, her fate was sealed. But the agony of her death was only just beginning. She listed sharply, her decks tilted at an angle that sent people slipping and tumbling toward the icy waters below. Lights had gone out across most of the vessel, plunging passengers into darkness. Only a few emergency lamps flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows on the panicked crowds. Inside the ship, chaos was indescribable. Corridors filled with water. Stairwells became waterfalls as freezing seawater poured down, sweeping away anything and anyone in its path. People clung desperately to railings, screaming, praying, clawing for air. Some fought their way upward, others were trapped, their cries fading as the sea swallowed them whole. On the upper decks, the human struggle reached a fever pitch. Families huddled together, whispering their last words to one another. Mothers clutched infants to their chests, shielding them from the biting wind. Fathers tried in vain to pry free lifeboats locked in ice. The crew shouted orders, but discipline had long collapsed. Every man, woman, and child was fighting for survival. Some passengers, overcome by terror, leapt over the rails into the Black Sea, preferring a quick death in the freezing water to being dragged under by the sinking ship. Their bodies struck the waves with hollow splashes, then vanished beneath the surface. On deck, lifeboats that had been successfully lowered were crammed far beyond their safe limits. People clawed at the sides, begging to be pulled aboard. Others tried to swim toward them, but succumbed to hypothermia within minutes. The Baltic Sea was a graveyard waiting to claim them all. The Wilhelm Gustloff's list grew worse with each passing minute. Furniture, crates, and even people slid across the tilting decks. Some passengers lost their footing and tumbled into the sea. Others clung desperately to the ship's rails, refusing to let go, even as the water crept higher. Below, the screams of the trapped grew fainter. Whole compartments were sealed off by steel doors, now flooded. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, never had a chance. As the minutes ticked by, the great liner began her final death throes. The bow dipped lower, dragging the ship downward. A thunderous roar filled the night as massive air pockets burst free, exploding through the decks in geysers of spray. The sound of collapsing bulkheads echoed like cannon fire across the Baltic. Those still alive on deck could only watch in horror. The once mighty vessel was breaking apart beneath their feet. At 10 p.m., less than 45 minutes after the torpedoes had struck, the Wilhelm Gustloff rolled heavily to port. Passengers clinging to the rails screamed as they were flung into the freezing waters. Lifeboats already launched were swamped by waves and capsized, spilling their occupants into the Black Sea. The final plunge was swift and merciless. The stern lifted high into the air, the ship's name visible one last time against the snow-filled night. For a brief moment, the Wilhelm Gustloff seemed frozen in time, her silhouette etched against the horizon. And then, with a groaning roar, she slipped beneath the waves. The sea swallowed her whole. On the surface, the cries of survivors filled the air, thousands of voices begging, screaming, praying. But the Baltic was unforgiving. Within minutes, the icy waters numbed limbs, slowed breathing, and silenced voices. One by one, the cries faded into the night until only the wind and waves remained. Of the more than 10,000 souls who had crowded aboard that evening, only about 200 survived. The rest, men, women, children, cadets, and wounded soldiers, perished in the frozen sea. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff remains the single greatest loss of life in a maritime disaster, a tragedy so immense that it defies comprehension. More lives were lost in that single hour than in the Titanic, the Lusitania, and the Empress of Ireland combined. For those few who survived, the memories were seared into their minds forever. The sound of the torpedoes striking, the screams in the darkness, the desperate fight for breath in the icy waters. And for the rest, the Baltic Sea became their grave, a silent tomb holding the lost thousands who had fled one horror, only to meet another. When the Wilhelm Gustloff disappeared beneath the waves, the nightmarish scene did not end. Instead, it shifted to the icy waters of the Baltic, where thousands now struggled desperately for life. The sea was filled with bodies, some still moving, thrashing, crying out for help. Others already silent, floating lifelessly in the dark. The temperature of the water was barely above freezing. For most, survival time was only a matter of minutes. Hypothermia set in quickly. Arms and legs went numb. Breathing became shallow. Voices faltered. One by one, those who had managed to escape the sinking ship slipped quietly beneath the surface. But not all hope was lost. The Wilhelm Gustloff had sent out distress signals before her power failed. German ships in the area responded as quickly as they could, though the conditions were treacherous: darkness, icy seas, and the constant fear of more Soviet submarines lurking nearby. The first to arrive was the torpedo boat Lova, which had been escorting the Gustloff. She immediately began pulling survivors from the freezing water. Her crew worked frantically, throwing ropes and nets over the side, hauling aboard half-frozen men, women, and children. Some were barely alive, their lips blue, their bodies stiff from the cold. Others slipped from rescuers' hands at the last moment, claimed by the sea before they could be saved. Soon after, other German vessels reached the scene: minesweepers, patrol boats, and even small fishing craft. Each one joined the desperate rescue. Crews leaned over the rails, shouting encouragement, risking their own lives as they hauled survivors aboard. Lifeboats that had managed to stay afloat were located and emptied. People clinging to debris were pulled from the waves. Every rescue was a struggle against time. The longer a person remained in the Baltic, the smaller their chance of survival. Many who were pulled aboard ships were already unconscious, their bodies so frozen that they could not even shiver. Sailors wrapped them in blankets, rubbed their arms and legs, and poured warm drinks down their throats in a desperate attempt to revive them. Some lived, many did not. The survivors described the experience as a waking nightmare. They remembered drifting in the black water, surrounded by corpses, hearing the cries of children and the prayers of mothers fade one by one. They clung to wreckage or to each other, praying that a rescue ship would find them before the sea claimed them. In some cases, survivors later recalled the haunting silence after the first frantic hour, when most voices had already gone quiet, leaving only the sound of waves slapping against lifeless bodies. By dawn, the rescue operation had saved approximately 200 people, a small fraction of the 10,000 who had sailed on the Gustloff. The rest had perished in the cold darkness. Entire families had vanished. Villages and towns would later learn that every single one of their refugees aboard had been lost. The German Navy's rescuers, though hardened by years of war, were shaken to the core. Many sailors wept openly as they pulled children's bodies from the sea. Others described the scene as worse than any battlefield, a horror they would never forget. One of the rescuers later said, "We pulled them aboard as fast as we could, but for everyone we saved, 100 slipped away. The sea was full of them, and we could do nothing." The risk of further submarine attacks forced the rescue ships to leave sooner than they wished. Every extra minute spent in the area was a gamble. They had to balance saving lives with preserving their own ships and crews. Eventually, with holds and decks full of shivering survivors, the rescuers turned west and headed for port. The rescued were landed at various harbors along the German coast, many in a state of shock. Some were so traumatized that they could not even speak, staring blankly into space. Others cried hysterically for families who would never return. Children who had lost parents wandered aimlessly, taken in by strangers. Medical staff worked around the clock to treat frostbite, hypothermia, and shock. Many survivors had to have fingers, toes, or even limbs amputated due to severe frostbite. For them, survival came at a heavy cost. As word of the disaster spread, disbelief turned to grief. Even in the chaos of Germany's final months of war, the sheer scale of the tragedy stunned those who heard of it. The survivors, meanwhile, carried scars that never healed. They had lived through what remains the greatest maritime disaster in history. Not a story of heroism and triumph, but of overwhelming loss and the cruel indifference of war. The rescue efforts, though heroic, could not overcome the scale of the tragedy. For every soul saved from the Baltic, nearly 10 were lost. And so, the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff passed from a desperate escape into legend, not as a tale of salvation, but as a warning of the cost of war, and of how fragile human life is when caught in the gears of history. The morning after the Wilhelm Gustloff sank, the Baltic Sea was eerily quiet. Only a handful of German vessels remained, searching for any last survivors. What they mostly found, however, were bodies, thousands of them, drifting on the surface or washed ashore in the days that followed. The scale of the tragedy was beyond anything imaginable. But as horrific as the loss was, it came at a time when Germany itself was collapsing. The war was entering its final months. Entire cities lay in ruins from Allied bombing. The Eastern Front was collapsing under the Soviet advance. In this climate, the fate of the Wilhelm Gustloff did not receive the attention one might expect. They feared that revealing the true number of dead, over 9,000 lives lost, would devastate already crumbling morale among the German population. Official news broadcasts mentioned the sinking, but the scale was dramatically downplayed. To the German public, it was presented as just another tragic loss of war, not the greatest maritime disaster in human history. For the survivors, however, the memory could not be hidden. They carried the trauma with them into the shattered landscape of post-war Germany. Many had lost entire families. Some children had been orphaned in a single night. Survivors often described feeling guilty for living when so many others had perished. In the years that followed, their accounts would be some of the only records of what truly happened on that frozen night. On the other side, the Soviet Union never publicized the sinking as a triumph. Captain Alexander Marinesko, commander of the submarine S-13 that fired the torpedoes, was not immediately celebrated. In fact, he faced disciplinary problems within the Soviet Navy and was even demoted. It was only decades later, long after his death, that he was posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. For the Soviet leadership in 1945, the event was treated as a routine naval victory, one among many as the Red Army marched into Berlin. This silence from both sides, the Germans suppressing it out of shame, the Soviets ignoring it for political reasons, meant that the Wilhelm Gustloff tragedy slipped into the shadows of history. For years, it was barely mentioned in textbooks, newspapers, or documentaries. And yet, the human cost was staggering. With more than 9,000 dead, the sinking claimed more than 6 times the lives lost on the Titanic. It was larger than the Lusitania, larger than the Empress of Ireland, larger than any other maritime disaster before or since. Why, then, was it forgotten? The answer lies in timing and politics. By 1945, sympathy for Germany was in short supply. To many, the Wilhelm Gustloff was seen not as an innocent tragedy, but as part of the wider consequences Germany had brought upon itself. But history is rarely so simple. Among the dead were not only Nazi officials or soldiers, but tens of thousands of civilians, women, children, the elderly, ordinary people caught in the chaos of a collapsing empire. They had fled their homes in fear of the advancing Soviets, only to perish at sea in the most terrible way imaginable. In the decades that followed, the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff lived on mostly in survivor testimonies and in the coastal towns of the Baltic, where wreckage and bodies occasionally washed ashore for months after the sinking. Fishermen sometimes caught glimpses of the wreck lying deep below the surface, a steel tomb resting silently on the seabed. It wasn't until much later, in the late 20th century, that historians began to re-examine the tragedy with fresh eyes. Books were written, survivor interviews recorded, and documentaries produced. One of the most notable was Günter Grass's novel Crab Walk, published in 2002, which explored how the memory of the Gustloff lingered across generations. Today, the wreck of the Wilhelm Gustloff remains at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, a protected war grave. Divers occasionally visit, but the German and Polish governments strictly limit access out of respect for the thousands who still lie entombed within. The legacy of the Wilhelm Gustloff is complex. On one hand, it is remembered as the greatest maritime disaster in history. On the other, it is a reminder of how war makes no distinction between soldier and civilian, guilty and innocent. In the end, the sea claimed them all alike. The tragedy also forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Who deserves remembrance? Do the civilians of an aggressor nation deserve the same sympathy as victims elsewhere? And how does humanity mourn when politics and history intervene? For the survivors, however, there was no such debate. To them, it was simple. They had seen mothers drown with children in their arms. They had heard the screams of the dying as the ship slipped beneath the waves. They had lived when thousands did not. And they knew, no matter what the world said, that the night of January 30, 1945, was one of the darkest nights in human history. The Wilhelm Gustloff may not have become a household name like the Titanic. But for those who know the truth, her story remains one of immense loss, silence, and the haunting reminder of war's cruelty. More than 75 years have passed since the night the Wilhelm Gustloff went down. The Baltic Sea has long since claimed her, sealing away the cries of thousands within a steel tomb. And yet, the echoes of that night still carry important lessons about war, memory, and humanity itself. The tragedy of the Gustloff is, at its heart, a reminder of how easily human lives are swept aside during war. When the ship set sail, it was not prepared for the immense burden it carried. It was a vessel designed for luxury cruising, transformed into a military transport, and then overloaded with desperate civilians. In many ways, the ship's fate was sealed before it ever left port. But perhaps the most haunting element of this disaster is how it was forgotten, or rather, deliberately left in silence. History often remembers events not by their scale, but by the narratives built around them. The Titanic is remembered as a symbol of human hubris and technological arrogance. The Lusitania as a turning point in World War I. But the Gustloff? It became entangled in the politics of guilt, shame, and vengeance. The Allies did not want to highlight German suffering. The Soviets had no interest in publicizing civilian casualties caused by their navy. And post-war Germany itself struggled with how to grieve the loss of its own people while confronting the crimes committed in its name. As a result, for decades the Gustloff tragedy was largely absent from public consciousness. Yet, silence does not erase truth. Survivors and their descendants kept the memory alive in private stories, in whispered recollections of that freezing night. Slowly, historians and writers brought the story back into the open. Today, it is increasingly recognized for what it was, the single deadliest maritime disaster in recorded history. So what lessons can we draw from it? First, that war spares no one. The sinking of the Gustloff was not an isolated tragedy, but part of the broader suffering of civilians in wartime. Whether in cities reduced to rubble, villages burned to the ground, or ships sunk at sea, ordinary people are always caught in the crossfire of power struggles. The Gustloff is a stark example of this, with thousands of women and children paying the ultimate price for decisions far beyond their control. Second, the disaster teaches us about the cost of forgetting. When history buries an event, the world loses not only facts, but also empathy. By ignoring the Gustloff for so many decades, we denied ourselves the chance to fully understand the human cost of World War II, not just for soldiers, but for refugees and civilians as well. Remembering these stories is not about assigning blame or excusing crimes. It is about honoring the dead and learning from the past. Third, the Gustloff reminds us that every life matters, even when politics say otherwise. At the time, the victims were Germans fleeing the Soviet advance. But on that ship were infants, children, mothers, grandparents, people whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Tragedy is tragedy, no matter whose side one is on. As we stand today, the wreck of the Gustloff rests quietly beneath the waves, protected as a war grave. It is a place of silence, respect, and mourning. Thousands still lie entombed there, their voices unheard but not entirely forgotten. The sea guards their story, but it is up to us to ensure that history remembers. And so, as we close this journey through the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff, we are left with a choice. Do we let the silence of politics and war bury such events? Or do we carry forward the memory of those lost, ensuring their suffering teaches us something lasting? Every disaster tells a story, not just of loss, but of warning. The Gustloff warns us of the dangers of war, of indifference to civilian suffering, and of the cost of silence. It asks us to remember that behind every number lies a face, a family, a life once filled with hopes and dreams. More than 9,000 souls perished in the freezing Baltic waters that night. They deserve to be remembered, not as statistics, not as shadows, but as human beings whose lives ended in one of the darkest maritime tragedies in history. The story of the Wilhelm Gustloff is not simply a tale of a ship. It is a tale of humanity, its frailty, its suffering, and perhaps most importantly, its responsibility to never forget.